Carol stood at the door of the high-end restaurant, feeling a pang of anticipation and anxiety. The grand marble columns and sparkling chandeliers were as opulent as she had expected. She tried to ignore the flutter of nerves in her chest. There was something about this place, its elegance, its pretensions, that always made her feel small. But today it wasn't the place that bothered her. It was the man standing beside her. Ken, her husband of 22 years, had insisted on bringing her to the restaurant for their anniversary dinner. Carol had been skeptical from the start. Ken was not the type to celebrate their marriage with a quiet, intimate evening. He liked to show off, always had. His work as a manager at his father's business afforded him the luxury of indulging his whims, and his latest whim was booking a $10,000 dinner for the two of them, plus his parents, who were already seated at their table. Carol shifted her gaze toward Ken, a quiet anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. She knew he had a tendency to overextend himself financially, but she had no idea he would go this far. When she had discovered the dinner reservation in his calendar, she had been shocked. He hadn't even bothered to consult her. When she looked closer, she realized he was using her credit card to pay for it. The card she had been keeping a close eye on because she'd been suspicious of his spending habits. He nudged her gently, smiling. "This is going to be a night to remember, honey. Trust me." Her smile was thin. "I hope so." When they entered the private dining room, Carol saw Ken's parents seated at a long, glittering table, already picking at appetizers. His father, a sharp, imposing man, barely acknowledged her as she sat down. His mother, always more personable, smiled warmly but soon turned her gaze to Ken, a look of mild disapproval passing between them. It was rare for Carol to feel completely out of place in her own marriage, but today she did. Ken had been acting strangely for weeks. Little things at first, late nights at the office, an increasing disregard for Carol's opinions, subtle dismissals of her concerns. But it was his recent use of her credit card that had made everything clear. She'd canceled it a month ago, just in case. When she had confronted him, he had lied straight to her face, claiming the card was fine, that he'd forgotten it was canceled. Tonight, she intended to show him that the game had changed. Ken grinned, his arrogance shining as he scanned the menu. "No need to worry about the bill, sweetheart. I've got it covered. I'm using your card." Carol forced herself to remain calm as the waiter poured them each a glass of wine. "Actually," she said, her voice smooth but firm, "I canceled the card a month ago." Ken's smile faltered for a split second, but only for a second. He chuckled, his voice falsely light. "Very funny, Carol, really, but it's all taken care of." Carol didn't say another word as he handed the card to the waiter. She watched his face as the waiter returned moments later, whispering something in his ear. Ken's face drained of color. "What's going on?" he asked the waiter, his voice suddenly less confident. The waiter cleared his throat. "I'm afraid your card has been declined, sir." The silence in the room was suffocating. Carol watched Ken's shoulders tense as he swiped the card again, more forcefully this time. The waiter took it without comment, returning moments later with the same response. Ken's cheeks were flushed with embarrassment. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. Carol stood up too, finally meeting his gaze. "Ken, the card is canceled. I canceled it." Ken's eyes widened, then narrowed as realization hit him. He stopped, his voice faltering, unsure whether to explode or apologize. But Carol wasn't done. "You've been using it for months," she continued, her tone cold. "Buying luxury items, paying for dinners, shopping sprees, things you never told me about." She didn't pause to let him speak. "I have the receipts, Ken. And that's just the tip of the iceberg." Ken's parents, who had been blissfully unaware until now, were watching in stunned silence. His father's eyes hardened. "What's this about, Ken?" Carol reached into her bag and retrieved her phone. "I've got more," she said, clicking a few buttons. She turned the phone toward Ken. On the screen, audio recording began to play, filling the room with the sound of Ken's voice, unmistakably captured in a conversation with another woman. Ken's face turned an alarming shade of red as his infidelity became public. "What's this supposed to mean?" He spat, looking to his parents for support. But they were already looking at him with disgust. The voice on the recording continued, the words cutting through the tension. Ken had been speaking to this woman about how he planned to leave Carol and start a new life with her. He'd even mocked Carol's age, calling her old and boring. The room was silent as the recording finished, and all eyes turned to Ken. His father's voice was low, his words carrying weight. "You've dishonored your mother, your family, and your wife. You're done. I'm pulling you from the business. You're finished here." Ken staggered back as if he had been struck. "You can't do that. I don't need you." His defiance seemed to swell, feeding his delusion. Carol could barely look at him now, the hurt in her chest burning hot. She had been his partner, his support. She had loved him for years, and this was how he repaid her. The room was thick with disbelief. Ken's mother stood, her face ashen, and slapped him hard across the cheek. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Ken didn't even react to the slap. He was already standing up, trying to salvage what he could, his face contorted with rage and pride. "I don't need any of you," he shouted, his words cutting through the room like shards of glass. Carol didn't flinch. She had been patient for far too long. "I'm done, Ken," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm divorcing you, and I'll get back every penny you've stolen from me." Ken's attempts at reconciliation were met with silence. His parents couldn't look at him. His future, what little of it he had left, was slipping away. The weight of his betrayal was too much for anyone to bear. As he stood there, alone in the silence, Carol knew that she had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life. There was no going back now. Carol walked out of the restaurant, her heels clicking decisively on the marble floors. She didn't look back. Her hands were shaking, but she steadied herself, drawing deep breaths. The evening had turned into a nightmare, one that she had long suspected was coming, but it still hit her harder than she had prepared for. Ken's words echoed in her mind, his defiant declaration that he didn't need anyone, not even his own family. His pride had been his downfall, but she wasn't sure he realized the depths of his loss yet. Maybe he never would. Outside, the night air was cool, and she welcomed the fresh breeze. It felt like a cleansing of sorts. The weight of Ken's lies, his betrayal, had pressed down on her for so long, suffocating her. But now she could finally breathe. Carol's phone buzzed in her purse. It was a text from her best friend, Gina. "I'm so sorry, Carol. Are you okay?" Carol didn't bother typing a response. She wasn't sure she was okay. She was exhausted, drained from the emotional toll of the last few hours. But there was also something else, a sense of clarity that had eluded her for years. She was done with Ken. The marriage, the facade, it was over. When Carol arrived home, she was greeted by the quiet of their empty house. The grand, silent house they had bought together. The house that, like their marriage, had grown cold and impersonal over the years. She set her purse down on the entry table and ran a hand through her hair, letting out a long sigh. Her thoughts turned to Ken, the man who had once been her partner, her best friend. She remembered their early days together, long walks, shared dreams, late-night talks. But somewhere along the way he had changed. He had grown more distant, obsessed with his career, with appearances. Carol had made excuses for him, telling herself that the late nights at the office, the quick trips, were just part of his ambition. But now she knew she had known for months that he was hiding something, someone. And now, the truth was out. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her reverie. This time, it was a call from Ken. Her stomach tightened at the thought of him pleading for forgiveness. He had already made a spectacle of himself, humiliating her in front of his parents. But this would be different. Carol took a steadying breath before answering. "Ken." "Carol, please listen to me. I know I messed up, but—" "Stop," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I don't want to hear it." "But Carol, I was wrong. You know that, right? I was stupid and I didn't mean to hurt you." Her chest tightened as she heard the tremble in his voice. He was playing the part now, the remorseful husband, the one who needed forgiveness. But Carol had heard it all before, the promises, the apologies that always fell short. "You've already hurt me, Ken," she said quietly, her voice unwavering, "and it's too late for apologies. You've stolen from me, you've lied to me. And worst of all, you've disrespected me in front of your family. In front of my family." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Carol could almost hear the gears turning in his head, trying to find the words to fix what was beyond repair. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said finally, his voice pleading. I was under pressure, Carol. I didn't know how to deal with everything. I thought if I kept up with the appearances." Carol closed her eyes for a moment. "That's the problem, Ken. You always cared about appearances. You never cared about me. You never cared about us." She hung up the phone, not bothering to say goodbye. The finality of it hit her harder than she had expected, but she knew it was the right choice. She had to let go. She couldn't keep living in a marriage that was built on lies and false pretenses. As she sat down at the kitchen table, her mind began to drift again, this time to the next step: divorce. It was a word she had never thought she would say aloud, but now it was a reality. She knew the process would be complicated, painful even, but it would be the only way forward. Ken would fight it, of course. He would try to manipulate, to gaslight her, to twist things so that he could retain control. But Carol wasn't afraid anymore. She was done with his games. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened the door, she found a package on the doorstep. It wasn't large, but there was something ominous about it. She picked it up, her mind racing. Could it be from Ken? A last-ditch effort to win her back. A part of her hesitated, but she took the package inside and tore it open. Inside was a single, plain envelope. Carol opened it and found a letter, written in Ken's familiar handwriting. But this wasn't a letter of reconciliation. It was something worse. "I'll make sure you never get anything," the letter read. "The money, the house, everything, it's all mine. You'll regret this." Carol felt a cold rush of anger flood through her. She had expected this Ken's refusal to take responsibility. But seeing it written down, seeing the arrogance in his words, hit her harder than she anticipated. This was his final act of control. He thought he could intimidate her into submission. But Carol wasn't afraid anymore. She had already made her decision, and nothing he said or did could change that. She crumpled the letter in her hands, tossing it into the trash. "You'll get nothing, Ken," she whispered to the empty house. "Not a dime." With renewed resolve, Carol knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be hers. The journey to freedom was just beginning. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and tense encounters with Ken. His attempts at reconciliation grew more desperate by the day, but Carol remained firm in her decision. She had sought legal counsel, and she was prepared for the fight ahead. Ken, though, wasn't taking it well. Every time Carol thought he might be coming to terms with the reality of their separation, he would lash out, accusing her of being the villain, the one who had ruined everything. Their home, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like a battleground. Carol couldn't even walk through the front door without bracing herself for the next confrontation. But she refused to back down. She had her own life to rebuild, now her own future. The final straw came one afternoon when Ken arrived unannounced at the house, a bag packed as if he had nowhere else to go. He looked unkempt, desperate. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was speaking in hurried, broken sentences. "I just need a chance, Carol. Please, I'll change. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't leave me." Carol stared at him, heart heavy but resolute. "Ken, it's too late for that. You've already shown me who you really are." His face twisted in frustration. "You don't understand. I love you. I can fix this, I swear." Carol shook her head slowly. "No, Ken, you can't fix it. You can't fix us." With that, she closed the door in his face, feeling the finality of the action settle deep within her. The door slammed shut on their past, on the life they had once shared, and for the first time in a long time, Carol felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. The weight of Ken's betrayal still loomed over her, but now it was just a shadow. She had reclaimed her power, and nothing could take that from her. Months passed, and the divorce was finalized. Carol moved into a small but cozy apartment, one that was all her own. The transition wasn't without its challenges, but every day she felt a little stronger, a little more at peace. She had her own space, her own rhythm. For the first time in years, Carol was living for herself. Ken, on the other hand, had spiraled further into self-destruction. His relationship with the other woman had fallen apart, and his estrangement from his family was complete. His once promising career in the family business had crumbled, leaving him with nothing but the wreckage of his own actions. Carol had heard from mutual acquaintances that he had attempted to re-enter the business world, but with little success. His family, once his support system, had turned their backs on him, and he was left to fend for himself, grappling with the consequences of his own choices. But Carol had moved on. She had made new friends, reconnected with old ones, and even started taking pottery classes, a hobby she had long ago abandoned. It wasn't just about filling time, it was about rediscovering herself, finding joy in the little things that Ken had never cared about. Carol was learning to be alone again, but not in the way she had feared. She was independent, content, and at peace with the decisions she had made. One evening, as she sat in her cozy apartment sipping tea, the doorbell rang. It was late, and Carol wasn't expecting anyone. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Standing at her doorstep was Ken, looking gaunt and disheveled, his clothes wrinkled and his eyes tired. I just wanted to see you," he said, his voice weak. "I know you don't want to hear it, but I've been trying to change. I've been seeing a therapist. I'm trying to make things right." Carol stood in the doorway, her face unreadable. She had expected this moment for weeks now, and though her heart had softened somewhat over the months, she couldn't ignore the pain he had caused. "I'm glad you're seeking help," Carol replied quietly. "But that doesn't change what you did to me, to us." Ken's eyes filled with tears, and he stepped forward as if to reach out to her. "Please, Carol. I don't want to lose you. You were everything to me." Carol took a deep breath. "Ken, you did lose me. And it's not because you made mistakes. It's because you refused to learn from them. You chose to betray me, to lie to me, and now I'm finally free of all of that. I'm finally free of you." The finality of her words hit both of them, but Carol held her ground. This was the moment of closure she had needed. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about reclaiming her own life. Ken's face twisted in frustration, but he slowly nodded, as if coming to terms with the reality of what she was saying. "I understand. I've lost everything, haven't I?" "Yes," Carol said softly, "but you can still find a way to rebuild. But it won't be with me." Without waiting for him to respond, Carol closed the door gently, sealing her past behind her. She leaned against it for a moment, her heart beating steadily in her chest. It was over. Finally, it was over. The next few months were a whirlwind of change. Carol focused on her career, started volunteering at a local shelter, and more than anything, rediscovered her sense of self. She learned that she didn't need anyone to define her, that she was strong enough to stand on her own 2 feet. Ken, meanwhile, continued to spiral. There were rumors about his attempts to reconcile with his parents, but they were unlikely to take him back. The damage had been done, and Carol knew that, in a way, it was his own doing. One day, she received a letter. It was from Ken's parents. It was brief, but it held something Carol hadn't expected: an apology. They expressed their regret over what had happened, how they had allowed their son's behavior to go unchecked for so long. They even offered an olive branch, inviting Carol to meet them for lunch. Carol sat with the letter for a long time, thinking. She had no ill will toward them. They had always been kind to her, even if they had turned a blind eye to Ken's flaws. But it was no longer her responsibility to fix the broken pieces of that family. She had her own life to focus on. Instead of responding to their invitation, Carol wrote a simple letter of her own. She thanked them for their kindness over the years, but explained that she was moving forward on her own path, one that no longer included them. It wasn't a decision made in anger, but in the knowledge that sometimes letting go was the only way to heal. As the days turned into weeks, Carol found herself growing more confident, more secure in her own skin. She learned that happiness wasn't something that could be found in a relationship, but within oneself. And for the first time in years, Carol was truly at peace. She looked out of her apartment window one evening, watching the sunset as it painted the sky with hues of orange and pink. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Carol was ready for whatever came next. She had learned to trust herself again, and that was worth more than anything else. So if you love this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.